Milgram experiment. Obedience to evil. In 1961, a young psychology professor at Yale University asked a terrifying question: how far would an ordinary person go to obey an authority figure? The answer, he discovered, shocked the world and revealed a disturbing truth about human nature that we're still grappling with today. Stanley Milgram proved that normal people, good people, under the right circumstances, are capable of committing terrible acts simply because someone in a position of authority told them to. His experiment didn't just change psychology. It changed how we understand evil itself. This is a story of the man who dared ask the question nobody wanted answered, and the experiment that forced us to confront the darkness within ourselves. The boy from the Bronx who questioned everything. Our story begins in the Bronx, New York, during the 1930s and 40s. Stanley Milgram was born on August 15, 1933, to Jewish immigrant parents who had fled Eastern Europe seeking a better life in America. His father, Samuel, was a Hungarian baker who worked grueling hours to support his family. His mother, Adele, came from Romania and raised Stanley and his siblings in a modest apartment where Yiddish was spoken as often as English. Money was tight, but education was sacred. Young Stanley was different from other children. He was brilliant, intensely curious, and obsessed with understanding why people behaved the way they did. He would watch interactions on the crowded streets of the Bronx, try to decode the unspoken rules that govern human behavior. But there was something darker shaping Stanley's worldview. He grew up during World War II, watching newsreels of the Holocaust unfold. He saw the faces of concentration camp survivors. He read about the Nuremberg trials, where Nazi officers defended their atrocities with four simple words: I was following orders. How could ordinary German citizens, people with families and jobs and lives, participate in the systematic murder of millions? How could teachers, doctors, and shopkeepers become executioners? This question haunted Stanley Milgram. It would drive every decision he made for the rest of his life. He excelled in school, eventually earning his way to Queens College and later a Ph.D. in social psychology from Harvard University. By 1960, at just 27 years old, he had secured a position as an assistant professor at Yale, one of the most prestigious universities in the world. But Stanley Milgram didn't want prestige. He wanted answers. Yale, ambition, and a dangerous idea. The early 1960s at Yale University. Stanley Milgram walked through the ivy-covered campus, his mind racing with a radical idea that most of his colleagues considered too dangerous, too unethical to pursue. He had just spent a year at Harvard working with Solomon Asch, watching experiments on conformity where people gave obviously wrong answers just to fit in with a group. But Milgram wanted to go further, much further. He wanted to test obedience to authority, not just whether people would conform to peer pressure, but whether they would inflict harm on another human being simply because an authority figure told them to. His colleagues were skeptical. Some called the idea brilliant. Others called it cruel. The university's review board hesitated, but eventually approved his proposal, probably not fully understanding what Milgram was planning. The setup was deceptively simple. Volunteers would be recruited through newspaper advertisements, offered $4.50 for 1 hour of their time. They would be told they were participating in a study about memory and learning. That was the first lie. When they arrived at the Elegant Interaction Laboratory at Yale, they would meet two people, a stern scientist in a gray lab coat, and another volunteer who seemed just like them. What they didn't know was that the other volunteer was an actor, and the real experiment had nothing to do with memory. Through a rigged lottery, the real participant would always be assigned the role of teacher. The actor would always be the learner. The teacher's job was to help the learner memorize word pairs. Every time the learner got an answer wrong, the teacher would administer an electric shock, and with each mistake, the voltage would increase. The shock generator sat on a table, impressive and intimidating, with 30 switches labeled from 15 volts to 450 volts. The highest levels were marked with ominous labels: danger, severe shock, and finally, simply XXX. Milgram tested the equipment obsessively. He rehearsed the actors' responses, the screams of pain that would come from the other room, the eventual silence that would suggest unconsciousness or worse. Everything had to be perfect. Everything had to feel real, because only if it felt real would he get real answers. In July 1961, the first participant arrived. Stanley Milgram watched from behind a one-way mirror, his heart pounding. He had no idea that he was about to witness something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. What do you think? Would you have continued if you were in that room? Would you have questioned the authority figure, or would you have obeyed? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The experiment that shocked the world. The laboratory is quiet except for the hum of fluorescent lights. The participant, a middle-aged man from New Haven, sits at the shock generator. His hands are sweating. Through the wall, he can hear the learner strapped into a chair in the next room. The test begins simply enough. The learner gets a few answers right, then makes his first mistake. 15 volts. A slight buzz. The learner says nothing. The participant relaxes slightly. Another mistake. 45 volts. Still manageable. The test continues. At 75 volts, the learner grunts in discomfort. At 120 volts, he shouts that the shocks are becoming painful. At 150 volts, he demands to be released from the experiment. The participant turns to the scientist, his face filled with concern. Should we stop? He wants to stop. The scientist, calm and emotionless, responds with a script Milgram had carefully written. Please continue. The participant hesitates. The scientist adds, the experiment requires that you continue. And here's where it gets disturbing. The participant continues. At 300 volts, the learner pounds on the wall, screaming in agony. At 315 volts, he pounds again, then silence. No response at all. The participant is visibly distressed now, hands shaking, voice trembling. He's not answering. Something's wrong. We need to check on him. The scientist remains unmoved. If the learner doesn't answer, treat it as a wrong answer and continue. What happened next shocked Milgram to his core. The participant, despite his obvious distress, despite believing he might be seriously harming or even killing another human being, continued all the way to 450 volts. Milgram had predicted that maybe 1 or 2% of people would go to the maximum voltage. He thought most people would stop early, refusing to harm an innocent person. He was devastatingly wrong. 65% of participants continued all the way to 450 volts. Nearly two-thirds of ordinary people, when instructed by an authority figure, were willing to administer potentially lethal shocks to a stranger. These weren't monsters. They were accountants, teachers, salesmen, engineers. They were people with families. They went to church on Sundays. They loved their children. They were, in every measurable way, good people. But when a man in a lab coat told them to continue, they obeyed. Milgram ran the experiment over and over with different variations. He tested 40 different scenarios with more than 700 participants. The results were consistently disturbing. Location mattered. Obedience dropped when the experiment was moved from Yale to a rundown office building. Proximity mattered. Obedience dropped when the teacher had to physically touch the learner. But even in the least authoritative conditions, a significant percentage of people still obeyed all the way to the end. After each session, Milgram carefully debriefed the participants, revealing the truth. No one had been shocked. The learner was an actor. The screams were recorded, but the damage was done. Many participants left the laboratory trembling, crying, questioning everything they thought they knew about themselves. One man, a corporate executive, laughed nervously throughout the entire experiment, continuing to shock even as he protested verbally. Afterward, he sat in stunned silence, realizing what he had been willing to do. Milgram had his answer. The same force that turned ordinary Germans into participants in the Holocaust was alive and well in America, in everyday people, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. Thank you so much for staying with us this far. The story gets even more intense, and the implications of what Milgram discovered will challenge everything you believe about human nature. The best is yet to come. Glory, Controversy, and Condemnation. October 1963. Stanley Milgram publishes his findings in the Journal of Abnormal and Social Psychology. The response is immediate and explosive. Newspapers around the world run headlines about the shocking experiment. Milgram appears on television, in magazines, in radio interviews. At 30 years old, he becomes one of the most famous psychologists in the world. But fame comes with a price. The criticism is swift and brutal. Fellow psychologists accuse him of psychological torture. The experiment, they argue, was deeply unethical. He had deceived participants, subjected them to extreme stress, and forced them to confront the worst parts of themselves. Diana Baumrind, a respected psychologist at Berkeley, publishes a scathing response, arguing that Milgram's experiment caused lasting psychological harm to participants. She points to the trembling hands, the nervous laughter, the tears of grown men who realized they were capable of evil. The American Psychological Association launches an investigation into Milgram's ethics. His membership is suspended for a year. Colleagues who once admired him now avoid him at conferences. The professional consequences are severe. Harvard University, where Milgram desperately wants to return and secure tenure, rejects him. The rejection devastates him. Years later, colleagues would say that Harvard's rejection was a wound Milgram never recovered from. His personal life suffers too. His wife, Alexandra, a dancer he married in 1961, struggles with the constant controversy surrounding her husband. Friends distance themselves. Milgram becomes isolated, bitter, defensive, but he refuses to apologize. In interviews, he argues passionately that his experiment was necessary. The world needed to understand the mechanisms of obedience. Without this knowledge, how could we prevent future atrocities? He points to the Nuremberg defense. I was just following orders. His experiment proved that this was an excuse invented by Nazis. It was a fundamental aspect of human psychology. Anyone, under the right circumstances, could become the perpetrator of evil. Critics counter that understanding evil doesn't justify inflicting psychological harm on innocent participants. The ends don't justify the means. The debate rages for years. Milgram eventually finds a position at the City University of New York, where he continues his research. He conducts other famous experiments, including the small world experiment that proved the concept of 6 degrees of separation. But nothing captures public imagination like the obedience study. It becomes a cultural reference point, cited in trials, used to explain war crimes, torture, corporate malfeasance, and police brutality. The experiment is replicated in different countries, with similar results. It's not just Americans who obey. It's Germans, Italians, Australians, South Africans. Obedience to authority appears to be a universal human trait. As the years pass, Milgram's legacy remains fiercely contested. Psychology textbooks call him brilliant. Ethics professors use his work as a cautionary tale. Documentary filmmakers make movies about the experiment. It becomes one of the most famous and most controversial studies in the history of social science. But the stress takes its toll on Milgram's health. He develops heart problems, likely exacerbated by years of professional battles and constant criticism. His work schedule is punishing. He chain smokes. He drives himself relentlessly, perhaps trying to prove his worth after Harvard's rejection. On December 20th, 1984, at just 51 years old, Stanley Milgram suffers a fatal heart attack at his home in New York City. He dies knowing his work changed psychology forever, but also knowing that many consider him a monster who tortured innocent people in the name of science. The dark legacy of a disturbing discovery. Decades after Stanley Milgram's death, his experiment continues to resonate. It's taught in virtually every introduction to psychology course. It's referenced in discussions about military atrocities, corporate scandals, and political obedience. The Stanford Prison Experiment, conducted by Philip Zimbardo in 1971, seemed to confirm Milgram's findings. Ordinary people, given authority and the right circumstances, will commit terrible acts. The Abu Ghraib torture scandal during the Iraq War brought renewed attention to Milgram's work. How could American soldiers torture prisoners? The answer, many argued, was found in a laboratory at Yale 4 decades earlier. But in recent years, Milgram's work has faced new scrutiny. Researchers examining his archives discovered that he may have pressured participants more than he admitted. Some participants reported that the experimenter became insistent when they tried to quit, using stronger language than Milgram described in his publications. Other researchers questioned whether the results were as clear-cut as Milgram claimed. They point to evidence that many participants didn't really believe the shocks were real, despite Milgram's insistence that they did. A 2017 replication of the experiment, conducted with modern ethical safeguards, found similar results, suggesting that Milgram's core findings remain valid. People still obey authority figures, even when asked to do things that make them uncomfortable. But the ethical debate continues. Would Milgram's experiment be approved today? Almost certainly not. Modern ethics boards would never allow such deception and psychological stress. Yet Milgram's defenders argue that this is precisely the problem. By making it impossible to conduct such experiments, we lose the ability to understand the darkest parts of human nature. And if we don't understand them, how can we prevent the next genocide, the next Abu Ghraib, the next atrocity committed by people who were just following orders? Stanley Milgram's widow, Alexandra, defended her husband until her death, arguing that he was a compassionate man who cared deeply about preventing human suffering. His children remember him as a loving father who wrestled with the moral implications of his work every day. The truth is complicated. Milgram was neither a hero nor a villain. He was a brilliant, ambitious scientist who discovered something profound and disturbing about human nature, and he paid a tremendous personal and professional price for that discovery. His experiment revealed that the line between good and evil is thinner than we want to believe. It showed that under pressure from authority, most of us will do things we never thought ourselves capable of. It proved that Hannah Arendt was right when she wrote about the banality of evil, that the greatest atrocities are often committed not by monsters, but by ordinary people doing what they're told. This is Milgram's legacy, a mirror held up to humanity, showing us a reflection we didn't want to see. And the question he asked in 1961 remains as urgent today as it was then. If you were in that room, would you have obeyed? The Milgram experiment forces us to confront an uncomfortable question. Would you have continued? Would you have administered the 450-volt shock? It's easy to say no from the comfort of your home, watching this video. But 65% of ordinary people said yes when they were actually in that laboratory. This experiment shows us that evil isn't always obvious. It's not always committed by monsters with malicious intent. Sometimes evil is committed by good people who simply follow orders. Sometimes it's committed by people who silence their conscience because someone in authority told them to continue. What do you think? Was Milgram's experiment ethical? Did he have the right to put people through that experience? And more importantly, honestly, do you think you would have obeyed? Leave your opinion in the comments. We want to know what you think. If this video made you think, if it challenged your understanding of human nature, subscribe to this channel for more stories that explore the depths of who we really are. And don't miss the next recommended video, where we explore other psychological experiments that change how we see ourselves. The truth about human nature isn't always comfortable, but it's always worth knowing.